When Whitney Houston died on February 11, 2012, Lionel Richie said one sentence, not a long tribute, not a list of memories, one sentence. The only person who could have saved Whitney was Whitney herself. Nobody knew that sentence had a second meaning, and that the second meaning was about a girl named Nicole. The music industry in the 1980s and 1990s was not a system designed to protect the people who worked inside it. It was a system designed to produce revenue, to find people with extraordinary talent and extract from that talent the maximum commercial value in the minimum available time, and to surround those people with the particular infrastructure of enablement that extraordinary talent tends to attract. The handlers and the yes people and the industry professionals whose livelihoods depended on keeping the talent producing, which meant keeping the talent happy, which in practice often meant keeping the talent insulated from the consequences of the behaviors that the talent had developed in response to the specific pressures of existing as an extraordinarily famous person in a world that did not fully understand what that meant. Whitney Houston had been inside this system since she was a teenager. She had been discovered by Clive Davis at Arista Records when she was barely out of high school, had been identified as someone whose voice was so extraordinary that the normal developmental timeline of a musical career did not apply to her, that the ordinary years of building an audience one small venue at a time could be bypassed entirely in favor of an immediate, fully resourced launch into the top tier of the industry. Her first album had gone platinum 7 times. Her voice had been described as a gift from God by people who were not given to that kind of language. She had performed the national anthem at the Super Bowl and produced what many people considered the definitive version of the song. She had starred in The Bodyguard, and I Will Always Love You had become one of the best-selling singles in the history of recorded music. And she had been, for the entirety of that career, surrounded by people whose primary relationship with her was organized around what she could do rather than who she was. Lionel Richie had known Whitney Houston since the late 1980s, since the period when both of them were among the most commercially successful artists in American popular music, when their names appeared in the same conversations and on the same award shows and in the same general cultural space that the music of that era occupied. They had been colleagues in the specific way that people are colleagues when they are both operating at the highest level of the same industry, aware of each other, respectful of each other's work, occupying adjacent territories in the same professional world without necessarily having the kind of daily proximity that produces the kind of friendship that runs deeper than professional regard. The closest they had come to genuine shared experience was the set of The Preacher's Wife in 1996, a film directed by Penny Marshall in which Lionel had his first and only significant acting role, appearing alongside Denzel Washington and Whitney Houston in a story about an angel sent to help a struggling inner-city church. It was not, by any measure, a performance that Lionel Richie would have selected as the context for his cinematic debut. He had agreed to it partly because of the music. The film contained a gospel soundtrack that was genuinely beautiful and that gave him a connection to the material that was stronger than the acting itself, and partly because the opportunity to work with Denzel Washington and Whitney Houston in the same production was the kind of thing that did not present itself twice, and that he understood, even in the moment of agreeing to it, would be something he would not regret regardless of how the acting turned out.
He was, by his own account, terrified. Denzel Washington had the specific quality of presence that certain actors possess, the ability to be completely real in front of a camera in a way that makes everyone around them acutely aware of the gap between acting and being, between performing a character and inhabiting one. Lionel found himself in scenes opposite Washington with the particular self-consciousness of someone who knows that the person across from him is extraordinarily good at what they are doing and who is not entirely certain that he is good enough at the corresponding thing to avoid the gap showing. He felt like a deer in headlights. He said so afterward without embarrassment because the honesty of it was more interesting than the pretense that it had gone smoothly. Whitney was on the set. She had the specific quality of the extraordinarily talented person who is also genuinely kind, the combination that is less common than it should be in an industry organized around the cultivation of individual exceptionalism. She saw Lionel's discomfort, and she did the thing that kind people do when they see someone they like struggling with something that they themselves have been through. She made it smaller. She told him to just be himself. She told him that the camera was not the point, that the scene was the point, that the other person in the scene was the point. She laughed at his nervousness in the way that laughter makes things manageable rather than dismissive. She was, on that set in 1996, exactly the person her voice had always suggested she was, someone whose gifts were accompanied by a genuine humanity that made being around her feel like something worth being around. Lionel noticed something, though. In the spaces between the laughing and the warmth and the genuine generosity of spirit that Whitney brought to the set, there was something else, something that he could not name at the time and that he would not understand until much later, when he had enough context to recognize what he had been looking at. There was a quality in her eyes, in the unguarded moments between scenes and between takes, of someone who was carrying something that the public version of Whitney Houston was not supposed to be carrying, a weight, a tiredness that went deeper than the ordinary fatigue of a demanding production schedule. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been performing, not on camera but in life, for so long that the boundary between the performance and the person has become blurred in ways that are difficult to locate and impossible to simply decide to stop. He did not say anything about it. He was a colleague, not a confidant. He was an actor in his first film, not a therapist or a close friend. What he saw was what he saw, and he filed it in the place where people file the things they observe but cannot act on, the place where impressions accumulate and wait for context, where the significance of what you noticed becomes clear only in retrospect, when the thing you were watching has arrived at its conclusion and the conclusion makes visible what the watching could not. 7 years later, Lionel Richie's daughter, Nicole, entered a rehabilitation facility in Los Angeles. Nicole had been struggling with addiction to heroin and cocaine, the specific, devastating reality of a young person whose access to everything had included access to the things that young people with unlimited access sometimes reach for in the absence of whatever the unlimited access has failed to provide. He had watched his daughter move through this struggle with the particular combination of love and helplessness that parents of addicted children know, the awareness that the love is real and present and unconditional, and the equally real awareness that love alone cannot fix what addiction does to a person, that the fixing, if it happens, has to come from somewhere inside the person themselves. He had been about to go on tour. He had a schedule, he had commitments and venues and the professional machinery of a major touring artist that does not pause easily or without significant cost. He canceled all of it. He said, "We are checking into rehab, not Nicole, we." He went with her. He checked in alongside her, not as a patient, but as a presence, as the specific demonstration that certain things are more important than tours, and that the most important signal you can send someone who is struggling is not words, but proximity, not statements of love, but the physical fact of being in the room next door when the room gets dark. There was a moment in a corridor. Nicole was walking toward her room, toward the beginning of whatever the process of recovery required, toward the specific difficulty of being somewhere you have chosen to be but did not want to need, and she stopped and turned to her father. She asked, "Are you going to be here?" It was the question underneath the question, not "Are you going to be here tonight?" not "Are you going to visit?" but the deeper question that people ask when they have been in situations where people who said they would be present turned out not to be. Are you really going to stay? Lionel said, "I'm right down the hall. I'm not going anywhere." And he stayed. Nicole recovered. Not immediately, not easily, not without the specific difficulty of recovery that anyone who has been through it understands cannot be glossed over or summarized without doing it an injustice. She recovered because she chose to recover, because something in her arrived at the decision that the life on the other side of the addiction was worth the cost of getting there. Lionel was down the hall. That was what he could do, and he did it. On February 11, 2012, Whitney Houston was found in the bathtub of her suite at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. The Grammy weekend parties were happening downstairs, the specific annual gathering of the music industry that had been Whitney's world for 30 years, the world that had taken everything she had and had not always given back what she needed. She had been alone. The cause of death was accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. She was 48 years old. The music world responded the way it responds when someone of Whitney Houston's magnitude is suddenly gone, with the outpouring of tribute and memory and the particular grief of people who have lost someone whose voice was a fixture of their lives, whose songs had been present at the weddings and the funerals and the ordinary Tuesday mornings that collect into the texture of a life lived with music in it. The statements came from artists and industry figures and fans and everyone who had known her or known of her, which was essentially everyone who had been paying attention to popular music for the previous 3 decades. Lionel Richie went on BBC Breakfast. He did not give a long tribute. He said one sentence. He said, "You know, I know from Nicole's experience, at some point you've got to realize that the only person who is going to save you, Nicole or Whitney, is going to be yourself." The sentence was about Whitney. It was also about Nicole. It was about both of them simultaneously, and about what Lionel had learned from being down the hall in a rehabilitation corridor in 2003. That the help you offer is real and necessary and worth offering, but that it cannot do the thing that only the person themselves can do. That the room next door is not the same as being in the room. That staying and being down the hall and canceling the tour and saying, "I'm not going anywhere," all of it matters, and none of it is enough without the thing that has to come from the inside. Whitney Houston had talent that Lionel described as being from God. She had a voice that most people in the history of music have not had access to, the specific instrument that is given rather than developed, that arrives fully formed and then grows into something that exceeds what even the person who possesses it can fully account for. She had people around her who loved her, and people around her who needed her to keep producing, and people around her who wanted to be near the light she generated, and people around her who could not always distinguish between those categories. What she did not have, in the end, was someone in the room next door. Lionel Richie has not spoken about this at great length. The sentence he gave to BBC Breakfast in 2012 is the most direct he has been, the clearest statement of what he understood about the parallel between Nicole's story and Whitney's, about the difference between the two outcomes, about what made the difference. He did not spell it out. He did not say, "The difference was that I was there for Nicole in the way that nobody was there for Whitney." He said, "The only person who can save you is yourself," and he said it with the specific authority of someone who had been down the hall and had watched it be true, had watched his daughter choose recovery and had understood that the choosing was hers, that the being down the hall had made the choosing possible without making it happen. Whitney Houston is gone. Nicole Richie is 44 years old, married, with 2 children. She stood on the Kennedy Center stage in 2017 and told the world that her father answers every phone call with "Showtime." She said he is the most grateful person she knows. She said he is the happiest.
She said these things about a man who in 2003 canceled his tour and went down the hall and stayed, who understood from 1996, from a film set where he had seen something in Whitney Houston's eyes that he could not name, that the most important thing a person can do for someone they love is to be in the room next door and refuse to leave. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Share this with someone who has ever been down the hall for someone who needed them, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for another person is simply to stay, to be present, to refuse to go. Leave a comment below. What did Whitney Houston's voice mean to you? And don't forget to ring the notification bell for more stories about the lives behind the music, the film sets and the corridors, and the sentences that say everything without saying everything.